Welcome to the Kaleidoscope of Possibilities, Alternative Perspectives on Mental Health. My name is Dr. Adriana Popescu. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and leader in the field of mental health, energy psychology, addiction, trauma, and empowerment. In this podcast, we will be exploring mental health from a variety of perspectives, from the spiritual to the shamanic and beyond. What if mental illness isn't everything we think it is? What if everything we see as a pathology is actually a possibility? What else is possible with mental health?
Hi everyone, Dr. Adriana Popescu here with you today with another episode of Kaleidoscope of Possibilities, Alternative Perspectives on Mental Health. I'm really looking forward to my conversation today with Dr. Connie McReynolds. She is a licensed psychologist and certified rehabilitation counselor with over 35 years of experience in rehabilitation counseling and psychology. She is the founder of Neurofeedback clinics in Southern California, helping children and adults reduce or eliminate ADHD, anxiety, anger, depression, chronic pain, learning challenges, and trauma. Through groundbreaking research, Dr. Connie has uncovered the underlying cause of ADHD, offering solutions that address its root rather than just managing symptoms. Her work equips individuals, parents, and educators with powerful strategies to transform learning, focus, and daily life. A sought after speaker, she is dedicated to lasting change. Welcome, Connie.
Hey, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm so excited about chatting with you today. So
Yes,
thanks.
yes, me too. And I love that we're going to be diving into a topic that we actually haven't covered on this podcast before, which is that of neurofeedback. So, love to hear more about that. But as always, we like to start the show with finding out more about our guests. So, tell us a little bit about yourself and how is it that you came to be doing this particular work you're doing now?
Again, thank you. It's always great to be able to share kind of where I've come from, but also where I want to go and how we can kind of help people along the way. So I really started in academia. I've been a professor for 25 years and thankfully retired from that a few years ago. So that was really part of where the institutes started. But my background probably began many, many decades ago, as most of us do. My mom taught second grade for 32 years in the same classroom. And I kind of joke that I kind of grew up in second grade watching her and what she did. My aunt was a dean of a college of education, and an uncle was a professor. So it kind of came from a line of education there. But one of the stories I really remember of my mother was, a little boy who was in her second grade class who couldn't read. And he was just struggling, and she got really concerned about him because she felt like, I remember her talking about this, if he can't read, what's he going to do? This is really not good. So over the summer, on her own time, and on her own nickel for gas, and me in tow, and my brother, she drove him 40 miles each way to a university where they had a learning center. And they were able to figure out back in those days that he had dyslexia, which at that time wasn't really well known. And with their help and my mother's dedication, they actually helped him learn how to read that summer. And I think that stuck with me because when I was writing my book, Solving the ADHD Riddle, I realized when I was kind of in the front end of this story popped back into my mind. And I thought, oh my goodness, it was kind of the awareness of almost a full circle moment of how I'm working with children who are struggling to learn how to read. And here, that was kind of the foundation for me all those years before that I never kind of put together, hadn't put two and two together. So when I came out to California about 16 years ago, it was to build an institute. The university didn't have any particular desire which way it went, which gave me free rein. And that was pretty good for me because then I was free to create whatever I wanted to in that institute. And what came about was neurofeedback. So a colleague of mine had been using neurofeedback in a learning school in Orange County and said they'd been having some really good luck with this intervention and helping these children who really were struggling and couldn't learn very well. So we studied that for a year, and word of mouth started getting out, and people started calling, and it's 16 years later, and people are still calling here in Southern California. I really don't advertise around here. I've done a lot of presentations, but it's like the psychologist, the the doctors, the neuropsychologists, physicians at hospitals and therapists, and someone will call so-and-so a therapist, tell me to call you. And I'm thinking, I don't have any idea who this therapist is, but it doesn't matter because they're coming and we're giving them help. So that's really how the whole thing started. And it just keeps evolving day after day.
So much I want to talk about with you, but first let's talk about your book. So the ADHD riddle. I love the title, of that, because I think there is so much confusion around what exactly, and not just with ADHD. I mean, I think this may be true of a lot of different conditions. Like, I don't think we have a very good understanding still of, and we're getting there. And science is starting to catch up. We're starting to better understand the brain and different things, but I don't know if we always have a very good understanding of these different diagnoses we in mental health work with, and where it's coming from, and then what do we do to help change it, or even heal from it entirely. So tell, because you referenced that, in your bio, this idea that we might actually be able to heal these conditions and not just better manage them, which is sort of the prevailing paradigm, right? Like, manage symptoms and learn how to live with it better. But I'm thinking maybe something else is possible. I'm thinking maybe you're thinking that as well. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Mm-hmm. So really the book came about after about, oh goodness, I'd say 12 years of work in my clinics. And so the title, Solving the ADHD Riddle, is really what I wanted to propel out into the world, because I want to change the narrative around this diagnostic label. And it started really in the beginning of my clinics, where parents were coming in and all the interventions the school had done, all the assessments they had done, the behavioral interventions. The parents had tried everything, and nothing was making a difference in how their child was able to go through school, which to me sounded a lot of alarm bells. It's like, well, if nothing's working, we clearly are not doing the right thing. So what's happening here? Why is it all of these resources are being expended on these strategies, and the parents are saying nothing has really changed? It might work for a little bit, but it doesn't work then. So what it took me about 5 years to really believe all of our statistics, because I thought, how could this really be that we're actually affecting all this change and no one is talking about this? And so after 5 years of really looking at the solid data that we had day in and day out, I started realizing, I think there's something else going on much deeper here than anyone has really ever delved into. And it could be literally the root cause of so many problems that children and adults are experiencing. And so we talk about these behaviors. So it's behavior management, it's medication management, but in the long run, is it working? And parents are saying, it hasn't worked for my child. Now, obviously, I haven't worked with every kid in the country or around the world, but the ones who I've walked in the door, these other things have not worked. So that's my audience here of what I'm looking at, and the folks that I have listened to over these years. And with the assessment that we've been doing, and I've recently retooled that. It was a license that we have from someone else, but I've recently created a proprietary license product that we can dive in a little different way now. But the core of this is understanding that underneath all these diagnostic labels, and I tell people, I don't care what you walk in the door with, we're still going to do this assessment. And when we peel all of that back, we're looking at 40 some markers of auditory and visual processing. We're also figuring out that there's this thing called fine motor hyperactivity that's different from just the little kid that can't sit still. There's a type of hyperactivity in the brain that can be kind of a quiet hyperactivity that doesn't manifest as a lot of fidgety kind of behavior, but very disruptive in the brain. And when we dial in and we find this, and it takes about an hour to get all of this information, it's all computer based, it's mouse clicking. That's going to generate about a 15 to 20 page report where we dive right in to all of that right at the time of that intake. And before people walk out, literally in that hour and a half or so, they have answers that they haven't had ever before. And I can't tell you how many parents have wept in these meetings when they see the words that they use to describe their child's struggle in this assessment report. And then there's something we can do about that, which is just simple brain training, which is what neurofeedback is. So really the root cause under so many conditions. And when people come in diagnosed with panic disorder, trauma, anxiety, depression, sleep dysregulation, We do this on everyone because 9 times out of 10 people have these auditory and visual processing problems that are underneath all of the diagnostic labels. And when we find this and build those training plans that are unique to that person, and we do this, it may take 10 or 20 hours to get that done over a period of a few weeks. The good news is, unlike going to the gym where we have to keep going all the time, you come to my gym for the brain and it resolves itself. We see the behaviors go down. We see success start to rise, and then it tends to hold because the brain has the power to create new kind of wired in brain processes. And once those get wired in and repeated, they tend to hold. And I tell people it's kind of like that bad habit you have. That's why it's hard to get rid of it. It's wired in. You have to rewire that part to have a different behavior or a different habit. It's the same concept. And all of that's based in the terminology or the term called neuroplasticity, which is our brain's ability to change over time. And if you're not in the ground, your brain can still change. I say so.
Which is so different, I have to say, from what I learned in school about the brain, right? Like, I remember learning, okay, you're born with like this many neurons, and like that's it. And if you mess those up, too bad. And that, this idea of like permanent brain damage and all these terms that sounded really hopeless. And now, as we've grown in our understanding, and I'm sure a lot of it has to do with being able to image the brain now and see things that we didn't know before, we find out that the brain is remarkably more neuroplastic than we ever could have imagined.
That we ever knew. There's such good research out there. Bessel van der Kolk wrote The Body Keeps the Score book, and he was one of the ones, the groundbreakers on some of the MRI studies, where he could actually see, it's like, hold on, this isn't anything like what we thought this was or what we had been taught. And so for people who've had trauma, I recommend that book because I think it's very helpful for people to understand how this gets hardwired in. And he references neurofeedback as a viable way to deal with trauma.
I'm really glad you brought that up because the question I wanted to ask is, well, how do these, how does this functioning of the brain, these alterations in the processing, right? Visual and auditory processing, how does that even happen in the first place? Like, what are the causes of that? And I was thinking about trauma and like how that affects, especially, adverse childhood experiences and how that affects the developing brains in children. Is this what we're talking about? Is it that maybe people are born with healthier brain functioning, but then it gets sort of dysregulated through life experiences?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's all that and probably more. So, we do know that there can be 5 children in a family. 4 of them don't have attention, concentration, or focus problems, but one does. Who's the outlier in that family? I've had that happen. And there's not a lot of understanding about what's happening with this particular child. Like, why can't you do what the rest of the family can do here? They don't really know why. But when we run these assessments, we figure out the why. It's like, well, there's this piece and this piece and this piece. And it's kind of like, I'll use the term with parents, kind of like Swiss cheese. You have Swiss cheese, you have cheese, and you have a hole right next to it. I'm not saying your child has holes in their brain, so don't go literal on me here. But what I am saying is that you can have functioning in one part and think that this is going to generalize or transfer over into other tasks. And when it doesn't, then that's an indicator that there's something going on. There's a processing challenge when they're switching tasks of certain kinds. There's auditory problems, there's visual problems. Some people kind of land in one house or the other, and some people have combination. And with trauma, what we know is that I work with a lot of veterans. I have a contract with the VA. But we see children who've been traumatized for a whole host of conditions, as well as adults. So it's not so much what was the, quote, activating event or the circumstance, but how did the brain respond to it? Because we know there can be a one-off condition, or there can be a long, chronic, complex condition of situations that people can end up having trauma from. You can have kind of what I call general PTSD. You can have the chronic complex PTSD. regardless of how it got there, the person's really dealing with a lot of difficulty in managing those triggers, kind of running their life. And when we can calm down that amygdala system, which is what we do with the neurofeedback, then we're literally, I tell the veterans, because they need language for what this means, it's like reinstalling the off switch on this system that got flipped into the on position and lost its off switch.
Yeah. It got stuck in on, and it can't shut down. Mm-hmm.
And you cannot very easily manually override that. That's why talk therapy has shown to not be very successful with some folks. Because at talk therapy and group therapy, I've had veterans tell me I get in there and I'm all fired up and it takes me 3 days to get calmed down. Again, because it hasn't helped that person. It might help others, but there's some people it doesn't.
And we've talked a lot about on the show, and obviously I identify as being a more holistic practitioner who is looking at the mind, body, and even spiritual aspects of different conditions and helping people to heal. And I think the body has been like the missing piece, because traditional talk therapy is really focused on the part of the brain, your prefrontal cortex, your logical thinking. We're having a conversation right now, languaging, all that's great. But like when someone, especially let's say a traumatized person who has an amygdala, a more primitive part of the brain that is malfunctioning, let's say misfiring, stuck on. And so they're constantly in this like sympathetic nervous system arousal. When a person's brain's been hijacked by these more primitive survival parts of the brain, there's no CBT happening. There's no ability to challenge. Okay, I'm having a panic attack. Let me weigh the evidence for and against the fact that I might be dying right now, because it feels like when you're having a panic attack, you could be dying. Right. Or I'm having a flashback back to, some horrible experience. You can't convince me that that's not happening right now, or I'm not in danger. That's where I think we fall short with traditional talk therapy, because it's not including the body and the brain and what's happening, right?
Mm-hmm. It's absolutely true. And it is so important that we open our minds as as providers of services, that it isn't a one size fits all approach here. Again, I have veterans in talk therapy. We're making progress. I have others that aren't doing well with that.
Yes. I wanted to ask you, Connie, so when you're assessing like this, I'm not sure if it's an instrument or what. That's why I wanted to ask this very unique assessment that you're doing. What exactly is included in that?
Mm-hmm. So really when I do this, and I'm starting to open this up for people that's not necessarily tied to neurofeedback. So I think that for parents who are needing some help with school accommodations, we can run these assessments no matter where you sit in the country. And we can give you information, because what we are literally looking at are 40 some markers of how the brain works with auditory and visual information. This can include processing speed, which what I will say to parents, this is so important to understand, because processing speed, if a child has slow processing speed in school, they're going to get dubbed as what? Cognitively slow. That's where it's going to go. And parents will say, I know my child is really bright. He or she's brilliant. And yet they're being channeled into this low cognitive functioning approach, which is so inappropriate for them. The good news is when we find that processing speed, we can take care of that. So we can get the brain up to speed, so to speak. So we literally can change that. We can change stamina. So if a child can't get through a task because they've run out of stamina, we can build that. So this is looking at these very specific ways the brain is working and finding those weaknesses. Some children, a little bit of weakness, but they're still stumbling. I've had other children who walk in the door and the families will describe them as being so sweet. We had one little girl years ago. She's a teenager. I say little, but because she was kind of feeling like a really young girl. And what we discovered with running these assessments is this child did not have auditory or visual processing capabilities. And she was, the look in her eyes was just kind of there. And so you would kind of think, gosh, what's going on with her? She doesn't really engage. She would give a minimal answer on query. And after 20 hours of neurofeedback, if we had done a before and after picture of this girl, you would not have said this was the same young girl, because her eyes were bright. She was engaged. She was interactive. She was just on it. She would never have had that had her parents not found my clinic and said, we don't think this is working right. There's something not here that's not working right for her. And they were on spot. They were on point. They figured that out. And so when we really look at these assessments, we're looking at the auditory and the visual, the fine motor hyperactivity. We also have some measurements for memory, conceptualization, and sequencing. And I kind of say that's the rubber hits the road assessments, because that's telling me we find the auditory and the visual, and then we pair it up with what we're finding in these other assessments, which kind of tells me how they're living their life. And so, for example, if there's a weakness in working memory capacity, it means the storage unit isn't big enough. That's how I explain that one. It's like, well, we just got to build your storage unit a little bit here. Auditory sequencing, this is where kids get in a lot of trouble at home and school, is if they have a weakness in this auditory sequencing memory. So this is where mom or dad or teacher says, go do this, 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 and this. And they go and do a little bit of it. Or on their way, they get sidetracked by the dog. Or, I can just go down a million examples of this. And so the thing that's always said to these children is pay attention. Pay attention. You're not paying attention. You're drifting off, whatever it is. And my comment to parents is if they could pay attention, they would. Because no child wants to be in trouble day in and day out by not following the instructions. These kiddos just want to do what they're being asked. They don't want to be in trouble. And so this is really where, for me, the rubber hit the road when I started uncovering the fact that these behaviors aren't willful in most children. Now, granted, you've got maybe have a surly teenager here or there you've got a little bit of challenge with, but most of the time, these behaviors are a product of the fact the brain isn't processing information adequately in order to respond to whatever the prompt is in their world, whether it's visual or whether it's auditory. For children with visual, we don't really talk about that a lot, but this is the kid who might be tripping over things or bumping into things or dropping things, or you walk into their room and it looks like a cyclone came through there all the time. They can't get their bed made. They don't know where their shoes are. They lose the backpack on the way home. We just did the homework. Where is it? They have no idea where it went. This is examples of visual processing. Auditory, I kind of gave one, which was the sequencing, but there are other auditory pieces of memory and hanging on to information. And so when we can peel back those behaviors and kind of look at those behaviors as clues. So if we look at that as what is this child demonstrating to me as the problem point. And so if they're drifting, then that's an auditory thing. If you notice that they can't stay on track, the classroom, the teacher, he's always looking out the window. I can't ever keep his attention. That's an auditory processing that typically falls in an area called vigilance, where there's a drifting off, a tuning out, and their brains get full and they lose track of where they're supposed to be. So there's so many pieces of this that I go into in the book. There's a lot of case examples in there, pre, mid, and post assessments that we use because we use that as evidence-based. So we do the baseline so we know where we need to head to. And after 10 hours of training, we come back and we measure it and retool the training plan. For areas that have responded, that's great. So we've got that one taken care of, but there's 3 more or 5 more over here that we still need to go after. And so we do that until they're demonstrating in their life changes, not just the assessment, but I want the lived experience, because you can do anything in my clinics, but if you can't change your life, what's the point? So you've got to be able to integrate this, and it integrates so naturally that most of the time people are not aware of it changing. It's the people around them that are seeing the changes. Or at school, there's a reduction in the behavioral interventions, or there's an improvement in grades and process.
Wow. And so is this all basically happening like through a computer? Is that what the mechanism is?
Mm-hmm. So neurofeedback is really called EEG biofeedback. So we have sensors. So the original biofeedback was using a sensor on your finger and kind of measuring pulse and respiration, that type of thing. So you got to see that happening on a monitor. So that was the biofeedback piece, so the biological feedback of what's happening in your body. And so neurofeedback is really understanding how your brain works. So we're measuring brain waves, and we can see some of that on the screen. But the cool thing about the system that we're using from a developer is that we use these very low impact, what I call the low impact video games. These are programs that are not going to drive dopamine, and we could do a whole program on the video games that are out there and the dopamine dump and the addiction that's taking place in kids and adults. Sometimes I have dads who are just as addicted as their kids are to this. So this is a feedback process. So you're in the program, we've got the sensors on your scalp, and it's measuring the brain waves, and the algorithm in the back end is running. So we set the parameters for really where we want the brain to go and how we want the attention to improve. And so if you're kind of generating those brain waves and it's going the way we want it to, then you're going to win your game. And so then kids get on the leaderboard. They have a code, so they don't have their names up there, but they have a code, and they kind of know where they fall. And so then there's reward systems built into that. And honestly, kind of what's happening is the video game is really the distractor so that your brain can do the work. Because we want, so it's really, that's what's happening. The brain literally learns how to do this. And we have children who are a little more amenable to that process than some of our overthinking adults with anxiety who want to pick it apart and kind of, oh, why is it doing this? And how's this going to help me? And it's like, well, I understand your question. Yeah, I get that. However, this is a distraction for your brain. So
Got it. So essentially, it's like they're playing these games on the computer, and whatever they're having to do is like rewiring the brain, essentially, right?
that's exactly what's happening. And so they're having fun and engaging while their brain is learning how to strengthen. So there could be mazes, or there could be ball games that they're playing. There could be any host of things that they're doing with their brain. And so what's really kind of cool for most kids and even adults is they get in and we hook them up and they're running the computer with their brain. And so that to them is like, first of all, for children who've been disempowered, that sense of, you mean I can run a computer with my brain, has its own kind of nudge to it that gives them this kind of, wow, I can do this. Well, I can win my game. Well, I can succeed here. And so that starts building on success. And that's really what this is.
I think that's so important, and I really want to highlight, because you kind of alluded to it a couple times. Is the empowerment piece, what I would call, because like I work with a lot of adults. I work just with adults, but who did have challenges in school, maybe at a time when the schools weren't really aware of things like you mentioned in the beginning, right? They didn't know about learning disabilities so much. Certainly ADHD was like not a thing yet, that people were really talking about or identifying. And so a lot of these kids were like flying under the radar, but being given labels like, well, they're being lazy, or they're underachievers, or they're daydreamers, or they're just not very bright. And the stigma of that, like what that creates for a child in terms of their growing self-esteem, is a lot of disempowerment, a lot of shame, a lot of limiting beliefs, like, well, I'm just stupid. And I would always see like how that would translate, into later life choices, and sometimes not so great choices, like, well, because I'm stupid, so I'll never like achieve much, so I have a dead end job, or I don't feel very good about myself, so I pick unhealthy relationships, or underachieving type things, because they don't believe that they actually can be successful, because they haven't had early life experiences of success in school. And like, can you comment on that? I'm sure you see lots of that also.
I see so much of it, just so much of it. And it's part of the mission that I'm on, I would call it that, which is really to change this narrative about what this is. And I've had adults find their way to my clinics. And I remember one gentleman in particular who came in and he was telling me he was on the verge of losing yet another job. And it's like, well, what's going on? He says, well, I can't remember what my boss says to me. And he gets mad at me all the time because I can't remember. And so we ran this assessment, and this guy did not have auditory sequential memory. So he could not remember what the guy was telling him. And the guy just gets madder and madder and madder at him, getting ready to fire him because he wasn't, quote, following through. And so when I gave this guy this assessment results, he literally broke down and sobbed right there because he said, I always thought I was stupid. It's like, you're not. That isn't what this is. You've probably dealt with this your whole life and didn't know what to call it or how to deal with it. And the good news is we found it. And the better news is there's something we can do to help you.
And I think it's so important to take the stigma and the shame out of it. I mean, I'm not even a fan of what we call like what the DSM, calls a disability, right? This is a learning disability. This is a attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Um, I hate that because I think it's so negative and stigmatizing and pathologizing. I'm so much more a fan these days of the term neurodivergent, right? Or my brain is different. Not everybody's brain is the same. In fact, they're probably way more different than they are the same. I think that's at least a step forward in like taking some of the stigma and shame out of this.
Mm-hmm. It's really what I'm all about. So when people come in or they'll call and say, well, I don't have a diagnosis, that's okay. Doesn't matter if you don't have a diagnosis, or I have this, and this. I had a gentleman come in, a veteran, diagnosed this. These are just the situations that I just kind of, oh goodness, diagnosed with bipolar disorder, personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, and the list just went on and on. Autism, ADHD. And I looked at him and I said, well, what if you don't have any of that? And he just stopped in his tracks. And I said, let's just figure out what your brain's doing. Let's find out what this is and see what we can do with it. And sure enough, of course, he had auditory and visual processing problems with all of these challenges he'd encountered, plus PTSD from military service. And so we have been working with him, and he still kind of gets hung up on those labels because it's so ingrained in people's minds that they have these labels. And it's like, well, I'm very clear with people. It's like, I really don't diagnose. And I'm not, prone to go that direction because what I'd rather do is just talk about what's working, what isn't. And let's see what we can do to kind of get the brain tuned up here. Let's see if we can create, these pathways that might be a little stronger for you, build some muscles there in your brain that maybe need to be strengthened, just like if you went to the gym down the street here and worked on your body. Let's just get away from those labels because to me, I get it. There's a time and a place for it. I used to teach abnormal psychology and psychiatric rehabilitation in a master's degree program, and I built that to teach both of those courses simultaneously. Because in rehab counseling, it's like, okay, here's the diagnostic labeling system you're going to run up to. This is all the abnormal psych that you're going to run into. Over here in the psychiatric rehab, this is what you're going to do about it that doesn't get sucked into and just buried in these diagnostic labels. You don't know who anyone is because they have a label. You cannot know who this person is. And that's our starting point in my clinic.
I mean, and the labels too, people often don't know this, but like over time, we've had multiple iterations of this, diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders. It changes every few years. The symptoms change, the labels themselves change, the criteria change. So it's not as clear cut as like, I have diabetes, which is like very specific with specific markers and these things like, these are sort of artificial categories and labels we've created and sort of thrown some symptoms in there. But when you look at like how bipolar overlaps with ADHD, which overlaps with PTSD, which overlaps with borderline, like what's what? Like it's really not so clear cut and definitive. So I'm with you. Like the utility of that is limited. And what I really don't like is the shame and the stigma that then people walk around with this label thinking there's something wrong with me. My brain is broken. I'm broken and there's no hope. And because of what I said earlier, because people think these are permanent conditions that can't be changed, the best you're going to do is manage it. And I think that's also the medication model, which I wanted to ask you about. It sort of to me just seems like it's a Band-Aid and we're not getting down to the root cause. So could you just make a comment there about, the predominant treatment modality seems to be, medication for these kids, stimulant meds.
Yes, it is. And it's kind of where I wax a lot on with parents because, many times when they find my clinics is because either it hasn't worked or they don't want to go down that route. So those are the folks I deal with. They're not the ones that are just out here looking for a prescription for something. And what I have learned over the years, I mean, this goes back 35 years from my beginning, as a rehabilitation counselor at the beginning of my career, which is these prescriptions take care of symptoms primarily when you're dealing with mental health. Now, I'm not against medication. I'm always clear about that because there are obviously certain circumstances where people need some help. It doesn't necessarily need to be the first line of approach with children in school who have attention problems is to whip out the, prescription pad because a child can't sit still or can't remember what's being said. Those pills aren't going to fix memory. It's just not going to happen. And that's wherein lies my challenge with some of the approaches around just thinking the medication's going to get there. Parents seem to have this awareness that it isn't the answer. And I think more and more of them are kind of waking up to this. I think there's a lot of parent groups that are really struggling with how do I help my child? And that's really why, I want to get out there and let people know we have some easy, approachable manners in which we can take care of this. You can get information in a very short period of time. And what I do is help write these accommodation letters for classroom based on the findings. And so I can actually create those reports for parents, can coach them a little bit on how do you present this in an IEP or a 504, how do you advocate for this? And when you get kind of a recalcitrant school district, it's like, are there some resources where they can navigate that a little bit better? Because there are just places that, honor this and others that don't so much. And depending on where the parents tend to fall is how big the battle is to try and get help for their children.
Right. Okay. So Connie, just briefly coming back to the neurofeedback process itself, what is the typical length of treatment, of sessions, or how do you gauge, does it vary a lot? Does it tend to be pretty consistent? I would imagine everybody's different. How does all that work?
Well, there is obviously uniqueness for each person because everyone's brain is completely different. And I've seen thousands of these assessment reports, and there are no two. Even with identical twins, they are completely different. So just, putting that out there for people to consider. The first piece of that really is getting that assessment. If we're looking at neurofeedback, is to figure out where we're going because we have to have a roadmap of where do we need to go with the training plans. So we do this in 10-hour blocks. It's 30 minutes sessions. We usually do that twice a week. And after those are completed, so the 20 sessions or the 10 hours, we come back and rerun these assessments because it's an evidence-based program. So we're dealing with data. And that's what sets us apart from some of the other groups is that we are actually dealing with hardcore data that measures and tracks progress of the brain changes. Typically, most folks are going to need 20 hours, which is the industry standard. So for us, it's going to cover a few weeks of that. We can do it remotely. We can do it locally in helping people. And then the process, though, is really to get to that point where a person feels like their life is better. And that is a little bit unique and individualized, or where parents are feeling like, we did the 10 hours and we're seeing a lot of good results. We're pretty good with this. Or parents are wanting to keep going. It's like he's made or she's made so much progress. We just want to see, can we make more progress and keep going? So parent consultations, I do the consultations after every 10 hours. We go over that data with parents and we talk about, okay, where's the progress? How are you feeling about things? What are you seeing in real life? What's happening here? And then they'll say, well, I think we're good to go, or it's, I think we need to do a little bit more. And it's like, okay, so here's what we will do next. And we create a new training plan then for that next set of 10 hours of training and then reassess again at that point. So we always know our checkpoints in figuring out what the progress is toward the goals that were identified really in the initial intake.
Got it. And then once the treatment is complete, is it complete, or do sometimes people have to come back for, I don't know, like booster sessions, or like I'm thinking if like a new life experience happens, let's say like a new traumatic event happens, might someone need to get like a additional treatment?
Well, we've had one or two people who had a car accident after we'd worked with them, and they came back because they felt like they were muddled, and they were. And when we ran the assessments and did the comparison from before, it was a different set of conditions that needed to be tackled. So typically, people don't come back. My goal really is get in and get out and go live your life and have a great one. That's it. Come here, go on and live. And we love our clients, but I really love them to be out just having their life. And, because it's a little bit of a commitment to be doing this. And if people can hang in there and be really consistent with it, we consistently see good results. With it, I can't guarantee anything, obviously, but because everyone's a little bit different. But generally speaking, we see really positive results. The clinicians and technicians are always so excited when someone comes in and they do their next reassessment, and we can look at that data and it's like, wow, look at this. This person just improved X number of points on this area that was weak. And it tends to hold. So the good news is I've had clients call me later, years later. I had one woman who'll come check in every 3 or 4 years. She says, I just want you to know, Dr. McReynolds, my brain keeps getting better. I'm back to where I was when I worked at the Jet Propulsion Lab when I was 19 years old. My brain can handle all of this again. And she had been suicidal because of all the PTSD that she had gone through. And she wrote something for me one time that just said she didn't realize how close she was to having made a permanent decision. And it was a friend who brought her in and actually paid for her sessions for her because she couldn't work. And then the trajectory for her has just been so remarkable that she's back and living a great life. And I've got hundreds of those stories, hundreds of them, where people have just said, gosh, I can't believe it. I had one mom who was really data driven. She loved data. So her son had completed, and he'd been out for like a year, I think, 12 months. She goes, I want to come back and run the data. It's like, okay, bring it back. And we could plot it. His brain continued to get better because once it gets going, it's going to continue strengthening that on its own because
It
that's
optimizes. Yeah.
It's repetition. That's what neurofeedback does. It's repetition and training. Once those processes get geared up and going, then they are self-perpetuating and self-growing.
And you find this, it's amazing. I mean, you're finding this across the board. I mean, we talked about a lot about ADHD, but you have mentioned that you work with a lot of other conditions as well. And it sounds like it's similar kinds of results.
Absolutely. Post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, panic disorder. We had a little girl here in Southern California. We can have some windy days. Well, she had a phobia, an absolute phobia about wind. And I thought, well, we've never had this happen before. So it's like, we treat a lot of this. So let's work with her. And it resolved. So that's gone. Changed her life. I mean, she couldn't get out of the house. She would just hide whenever the wind blew. It's case after case after case of situations like that, even tics. So some children will have tics, nervous tics. Sometimes it's called Tourette's. Sometimes it's misdiagnosed as that. Kind of, again, doesn't matter what we call it, but we're able to get that resolved in a lot of cases. We've even worked a little bit with mild to moderate autism. So that takes a lot longer. We're dealing with a lot more there, but we have helped improve some of the behaviors, particularly when we find underlying all of that are auditory and visual processing problems, because that we can tackle. We can tackle it.
I just think the possibilities are endless. Even thinking about like more sort of medical, physical health issues as well, right? Like high blood pressure, heart conditions, things like that. Like, so much now we're learning like stress is at the root of everything, right? Stress and inflammation. Well, what's causing stress? Well, a brain that's, maybe been hijacked by that fight, flight, freeze response or traumatized brain or whatever it is. And so I wonder how much healing for the body is also possible when you're able to rewire the brain and help it function, in a healthier way. Does that then help the body to heal itself from whatever the different medical conditions are?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think Basil van der Kolk really nailed that in his book, because if you start taking care of these aspects, then you find that health improves. And so when we really deal with the fact that if we're under chronic stress, we have a lot of this going on, it's dumping adrenaline and cortisol into the body, and that wears out our organs, it wears us out, it affects our sleep, it affects our appetite, it affects everything. And if that amygdala system is just fired up, which is what anxiety and stress and all of that does, it becomes a chronic condition. And the body and the brain don't necessarily know on their own how to retool that because it's a chronic condition, a chronic pattern. And so we introduce a different way for the brain to respond to that. And what I think also is kind of important is when our amygdala is fired up, our frontal lobe is shutting down. So when we've got a fired up amygdala system, our decision making, our problem solving capabilities diminish almost in direct proportion to how fired up that amygdala system is. And so when we've got people who are in that, they're making poor decisions because they can't think their way through. Well, those can be life-changing events that are uncomfortable at times too. And so imagine if we could take care of that.
I mean, so excited, like for someone who also works in addiction. And I know that neurofeedback, I've worked in programs that have used neurofeedback. It is exactly what you're saying. It's the prefrontal cortex is offline. So there's impulsivity, there's like some bad decision making, or people are triggered, emotionally triggered, stress triggered, the amygdala is firing, and they're not thinking, I'm going to play, I need to play the tape through and think about what, if I drink right now, what that's going to, they're not thinking that. They're like straight to the liquor store. And so the implications for that, for treating addiction and nowadays addiction, to like the phones and the internet and all the other things that are like, wreaking problems for our youth and all the things, people in general. The implications are so vast and the possibilities are endless for how this work could really help people and help our society as a whole.
Mm-hmm. It really is. And that's what makes it so exciting. I've been at it for 16 years and it feels like we're just getting started every day. So it's like, where can we go next and how can we apply this? And that's why the new programs that I'm thinking about rolling out, which gives people the front end answers of this, if they're not quite ready to jump into the neurofeedback, we can get information for them. So imagine in the workplace, I had a veteran, and this is what triggered this about 1.5 years ago, is I was working with a woman who's a veteran, and she was in a call center, and she was working for a company, and she was on her second performance improvement plan, which is never a good thing. And she was trying to describe her struggle. And after the second time I met with her, I asked her if we could run the assessment, and we did. This woman didn't have any auditory processing capability, and she's sitting in a call center.
Wow. Amazing stuff. Okay, so Connie, if people want to find out more about your work, the clinics, your book, like where should they go?
You can go to my website, which is my name, Connie McReynolds, ConnieMcReynolds.com. And it's all there. There's a button for ADHD. There's one for neurofeedback that explains it. A little bit more about me, individual therapy. You can get it all right there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, one, for the work that you're doing in the world and empowering people to know that there is hope and there is healing and we can rewire the brain and all these like amazing things that you're doing. And thank you so much for sharing that with us today. And thank you, audience, for tuning in and watching or listening the show. As always, if you find this information helpful, please pass it along, share it, subscribe, rate, review, all the things that will get this information out there in the hands of the people who are looking for it. So thanks, everyone. Thanks, Connie. See you next time.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of Kaleidoscope of Possibilities, Alternative Perspectives on Mental Health. This has been Dr. Adriana Popescu. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe and share with others. To find out more about me, my guests, and more, please visit my website at adrianapopescu.org. See you next time.